Okay, so welcome to electronic lectures. Lucky us. I haven't done this before, so I will apologize in advance. I have no idea what the quality of this will be, but we'll give it a shot. As I understand it, we're doing this for the rest of the semester, online courses. So for each of the subject areas we had planned for the rest of the semester, there will be an electronic lecture attached to the PowerPoint, which will be uploaded to Moodle as I complete them. I don't know yet exactly how we're doing the final exam. I will let you know as soon as all that is confirmed. I've never given an exam electronically, so I've got to talk to somebody who knows what they're doing, and I'll get them to give me some pointers. I don't know yet whether we're going to do quizzes online. I'm looking into it. I hope to be able to do that because I think actually it would probably be a boon for you guys. It would be good because it would allow you an opportunity to improve your grades. So I will keep you updated by email so you have something in writing, but also at the beginning of each lecture I'll kind of give you an update as to how I understand things are going and what the plan is and that sort of thing. All right. Well, with all that being said, let's jump in. This is kind of a long PowerPoint. I will do my best, which you know how that generally goes, to stay on point and move through this fairly quickly. The nice thing is you get to pause me as, don't you wish you could do that in class? You can pause me as you need to. All right, here we go. So what we're talking about here is stress and coping. Probably my favorite stuff to talk about, maybe, and all the material that we cover. We'll operationally define the term like we usually do. So what we're talking about here is the body's physiological response to, you could say, perceived environmental threats. The classic definition that it's the response of the body to any demand placed on it. You can even make the argument that it's the response of the body to any change. What we mean by that is, say for example you're asleep and somebody comes into your room and makes a noise. What we know by looking at EEGs and various functional scans is that even when you're in fairly deep sleep and somebody comes in and makes a noise, or there's a siren that goes off outside, or somebody turns on a light or something like that, your brain actually does respond. And of course, when that happens, your body has to marshal resources. You have to burn energy. So you can make the argument that stress is the response to any change in the environment. Of course, if you do that, then it's almost meaningless, simply because change is constant, right? Everything is always changing, so your body is always responding to that. So what we generally use when we talk about stress is the second purple bullet point there, which is a physiological situation in which the body is responding to an environmental demand that exceeds its regulatory capacity. So in other words, you're responding to something and you're having some degree of difficulty. You can go a little bit further, and that's the context where we usually talk about stress, which is the body not responding appropriately or not responding sufficiently to an environmental demand. That one of the complications here is that we're using this word stress not just a term to talk about the physiological response, the organism's biological response to the environment, but also the environment itself, where the stress referring to the environmental event that requires you to respond to it. So physical, cognitive, emotional, strain, or stress. So the term actually applies to these two different but related things. One having to do with an environmental event, which we usually think about as problematic. It's a stressor. And then the other one having to do with the body's physiological response to that stressor, to that event. So both of these things we talk about when we talk about stress. One thing to keep in mind is that we generally, when we talk about stress, we talk about it in a negative sense. And we'll talk about it in this lecture predominantly in terms of it being a negative thing or a problematic thing that has to be responded to. But there is actually a positive context in which we talk about this. Excuse me. There's this concept, eustress, which means quite literally good stress, like euphoric. Is a good feeling. Eustress is good stress, and it's basically your sense of dissatisfaction with your situation when you feel like you can do something about it. So eustress is something where you are responding to an environmental event that you don't like. Usually, it's a fairly mild dislike, and you feel like you're capable of dealing with it. So eustress, this positive stress, is positive because it tends to motivate and focus your attention and energy. It tends to be short-term and manageable, and it tends to improve performance. Eustress would be things like, I don't know, for some people, going and playing pickup basketball, right? You actually seek it out. Is it stressful? Yeah, it's physically demanding. There's a challenge that has to be met. It's a competition, so you can lose it. But it's productive. It's enjoyable. It's pleasant. Well, particularly pleasant if you win, right? If you're able to respond successfully to it. So there is this concept of eustress, and that idea that we talk about when we talk about eustress, that idea that integral to the idea of it being productive is the sense that a person has that they're capable of responding effectively. That's important because later when we talk about coping with stress, that appears to be one of the primary things that allows you to actually cope effectively, is that not so much what's happening in your environment, not so much the stress itself, but how do I feel about the stress? But I'll leave that for a little bit later when we start talking about coping. When we talk about a body's response, a person's response to stress, we often talk about it in terms of this human function curve. And basically what this is graphically representing for you is that performance on the vertical axis there is affected by arousal level. So when you have a very low level of arousal, there's not a whole lot going on, performance doesn't tend to be optimized. In order for optimal performance, you need a certain degree of stressor. Think about this kind of like hitting a baseball. If you ever go to a batting range, and they have the different cages, they have like the slow pitch softball cage, and then the fast pitch softball cage, and then the 30 mile an hour, 50 mile an hour, 70 mile an hour, and 90 mile an hour baseball cages. How fast the ball is being thrown at you. If you are very relaxed and you just got to the cages and you step right into the fast pitch baseball, a 90 mile an hour cage, the likelihood that you're going to make contact is virtually nil. The odds you're going to actually be able to hit the ball are virtually nil. You need a certain level of arousal, a certain level of concentration, a certain level of stimulation in terms of your blood pressure and your heart rate and your breathing. You need to be focused. There needs to be a certain amount of arousal, of physiological arousal, in order to make you function as effectively as you can, to be as tuned in as you can be. So that's what the graphic here is representing, that a moderate level of arousal tends to promote optimal performance. And I'm talking about it in terms of physical performance in a baseball cage. But the reality is it's the case also psychologically or cognitively. If you come into an exam too chilled out, too relaxed, you probably aren't going to do as well as you would if you came in a little bit jazzed up, a little fairly intense, fairly focused, but obviously not too focused. If you come in too aroused, blood pressure too high, heart rate too high, respiration rate too high, what you experience that as is anxiety, stress anxiety, test anxiety. So the other thing, other than moderate arousal, medium arousal being associated with optimal performance, the other thing that this chart is showing you is that once arousal exceeds kind of a medium high level, you get to the point where performance starts to drop off. Test anxiety. Stepping into that 90-mile-an-hour cage, if you've ever done that, it's actually scary as crap because that ball can hurt you or kill you. It's going so fast. So you get in that cage and you're freaking out. It's a frightening experience, which is why most people don't perform as well in that situation. So that's what the human function curve is representing. All right, you're going to get a little glitch here because I'm actually going to pause this and make sure that all this is recording since I'm now 10 minutes into the lecture. Hold on one second. Okay, back. So on the human function curve, you'll note that there was a line where that we designate as the stress zone. And this is basically when the arousal level reaches the point that performance begins to deteriorate. What exactly are we talking about in this situation? Well, what we're talking about essentially is kind of the beginning of the fight or flight reaction, which you guys have probably all heard about before. And this is essentially your body calling all hands on deck. It's activating you're producing a sympathetic nervous system response. Remember that automatic nervous system that is intended to produce the energy necessary in your body to keep you alive when you're facing a threat. So, I don't know, you're walking in the woods and you come around a bend and there's a grizzly bear, right? This is what happens in your body automatically. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to make it happen. You walk around that curve and you see that grizzly bear, and this happens automatically. It doesn't have to be that extraordinary. It can be other things. You can have a lesser sympathetic nervous system response to lesser stressors. You have a little bit of a sympathetic nervous response every single time you come into class, right? You don't know what, you have a general idea, which is the reason why you don't have a strong response. You have a general idea of what you're going to face, but you don't know exactly. So your body kind of ramps up a little bit. Think about how it goes over the course of the semester. The first day you come into class, the first day of class, your sympathetic nervous system response is a little more pronounced. You're a little more anxious. You're a little bit more on your toes because you really genuinely don't know within certain parameters what to expect. As class periods go by and the semester progresses, presuming that things are going okay in the class and the professor's not a complete jerk and you're doing okay and people in class are fairly nice, your sympathetic nervous system response, that arousal response, tends to moderate as you become comfortable. So what we're talking about is just that your body's general response to any sort of significant stimulation and certainly to threats in the environment. So physiologically, what we're looking at, this parasympathetic nervous system response, this arousal response to a threat or to stimulation, heart rate increases, respiration rate, and volume. So your lungs, you're taking in more air over time. Your blood flow is increased and diverted. It's diverted away from the internal organs into the peripheral muscular system. And this is basically, you're not worried about digesting food. You're not worried about all of the kind of the maintenance processes that your organs are responsible for. What you're concerned about, what your body is preparing for, is survival, running away from something, fighting something, fight or flight, right? You get this big insulin response. You get a lot of sugar being released by the liver And that's basically providing the energy to the muscles in your body so your muscles can do what they got to do. Your pupils dilate. You get your vision gets very, very focused on whatever is in the center of your visual field. People will often talk about vision becoming very, very acute. You can see things when you have this arousal response. You can see things more clearly in that period of time. You get baseball players, you go back to the baseball example, you get baseball players who will talk about being at bat in a game, and the pitcher will throw the ball, and they'll talk about actually being able to see the laces on the ball. And we hear this so consistently. I mean, it's unimaginable if you've ever stood in and had somebody throw a baseball at you. The idea that you could actually see so acutely that you could see these laces is almost unimaginable for the average person. But apparently, it's reported so consistently, there must be something to it. So vision, the acuity of vision increases. Interestingly, you sometimes get some auditory exclusion. That's usually in extreme arousal, and that probably is partly blood pressure related. If you get a big surge in blood pressure, one of the things you'll often notice is hearing diminishes, and sometimes you'll actually even get some ringing in your ears just from how high the blood pressure is. Obviously, your reflex time decreases. Your reflexes become quicker. You'll see somebody either get very pale or get red, or sometimes going back and forth between the two, and that basically has to do with blood rushing to the peripheral muscles and skin. One of the things that happens with the blood being diverted away from your internal organs is your digestion slows down or stops. Sexual arousal is inhibited, and that's partly a blood flow issue, but it's also a survival thing. You know, you're not, if a bear is getting ready to eat you, you're not focused on reproduction, you're focused on surviving. In truly extraordinary and extreme situations, what we find also in this arousal response that your body has, this automatic response, is you can even have it so extreme that your bladder relaxes and your colon evacuates. And what that means is you poop and you pee yourself. Presumably, this is also a survival response, because if something, think about it like this, we evolved predominantly in situations where the most severe threats, immediate, acute threats, were predation, that something was trying to kill you, presumably to eat you. And if a large predator, say that bear, was trying to eat you, and you were sufficiently frightened that you urinated and defecated on yourself, you become a much less interesting meal for that predator. So it does kind of make sense in extraordinary circumstances that you get that bladder relaxing and colon evacuating sort of a response as part of this physiology. Obviously, associated with all these basic physiological functions, you get the increase in emotional and psychological tension. The brain gets very tuned in to potential danger. And this is important because if you expose somebody, and we're going to talk about this again in a little bit, but if you expose somebody to repeated significant stress, so you got somebody in a situation where bad things are happening again and again and again and again, so they're getting the stress response again and again and again and again. And part of that stress response is your brain being very aware of what is dangerous. Over time, what happens is your brain gets so good at being tuned into danger that it's almost like it forgets how not to be that way. If you have, I'll give you the classic example of somebody being raised in an abusive environment. You know, if you're raised from early childhood in an environment where the slightest misstep puts you in danger of being beaten, say, or God forbid you're in a situation, the person is in a situation where they're being raised in an environment where sexual abuse is serial. It's happening again and again and again, and you're not ever really safe. Well, what that does over time with the brain, you're continually having this arousal nervous system response, this automatic arousal in your nervous system, part of which is the brain getting very tuned in to potential threats, which is a good thing when you're actually in that situation. Well, what happens to people who are raised in a physically abusive or sexually abusive or both early childhood environment is they grow up, they're exposed to that over years and years and years and years. When they finally leave that environment and now they're no longer being threatened, their brain has gotten so used to being attuned to danger that they can't turn it off. It's the way their brain functions now. So they walk around the world anticipating threats that probably aren't there. And they can even know this. They can, part of their brain is going, why am I reacting like this? But this deep down instinctual, this automatic part of your brain is telling them, no, you're in danger, you're in danger, you're in danger. It's that automatic response. So that's actually not, that's no small thing. That part of this physiological fight or flight response is your brain being tuned into danger. We'll talk a little bit later, we'll talk about why that becomes such a big deal for everybody, not just people who are in really horrible situations. But so you have this fight or flight response. And basically what you're setting up are one of three reactions. We talk about it being the fight or flight response. Anger, the body is preparing itself to be angry. And basically that's to give you an advantage if you end up in a fight. To be afraid, so that you can run away. Or in worst case scenario, and this is probably the best thing you could do if you were confronted by that grizzly bear that I was talking about earlier, is absolute terror and paralysis. What they tell you if a grizzly bear attacks you is play dead, because you can't outrun it, you can't fight it, you can't, there's nothing you can do. It's an absolute apex predator. The best thing you can do is to look like something that is not a threat to it. So the three responses: anger and fight, panic and flight, terror and paralysis. One of the things you'll notice is anger, panic, and terror all have basically the same underlying physiological building blocks. The physical sense of being angry, the physical sense of being afraid are actually very similar, right? Your heart rate, the autonomic nervous system response, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, you breathe faster. If it's sufficiently intense, you get a little bit of a tingle, you get hot. You might get cold. In some cases, you get cold, but most of the time you feel very hot. You feel hot and sweaty, and but the underlying physiological responses to these three experiences, anger, panic, and terror, are fundamentally the same, and they are that autonomic nervous system threat response. So all of this are the underpinnings to your body getting preparing itself to fight, run away, or in truly dire circumstances, freeze or play dead. Basically, you think about it like this: if you get enough of that autonomic nervous system response, if it becomes intense enough, you can actually pass out. So it actually, the whole progression physiologically does make sense. But the thing to keep in mind is that with all of this, this has for the history of the human species been a very productive, effective physiological response. It evolved to cope with the kinds of threats that our species were exposed to, predominantly predation by apex predators, right? Bears and tigers and large cats, the snakes, these sorts of things, right? And other human beings, obviously. So the problem with this, I'm actually going to pause this real quick and then we're going to pick back up. So the problem with this is that we no longer live, most of us no longer live in an environment where we are subject to apex predators. The stresses that we deal with are not the likelihood of being eaten or attacked, certainly today, even by other humans. The truth of the matter is that despite what you see in the media, violent crime is way down. Your likelihood of being attacked, assaulted, is extraordinarily minimal. And if you discount certain areas where that kind of crime is concentrated, then certain parts of big cities, essentially, if you remove those from the equation, the likelihood of you being subject to any sort of violence, which, let's face it, that's what this stress response by the body was evolved to respond to. In the modern world, the likelihood that that's going to happen to you is essentially zero, or very close to zero. That doesn't mean that we're not subject to stress. Well, of course we're subject to stress. The problem is that the stressors that we are now exposed to, one, don't tend to be short-term, and two, don't tend to be the kind of stresses for which this preparation for fight or flight would be a good response. The nature of modern day stress, unfortunately, is that it is, in existential terms, fairly mild. In other words, the kind of stresses that we're exposed to in daily life are not the kinds of things that are going to kill you. The cost of gasoline, do I have enough money in my bank account? Wow, the psychology professor is a pain in my butt. Does that guy or girl like me or not like me, or my friends being nice? These kinds of things, they aren't life-threatening. They're stressful, but they're not life-threatening, and they don't tend to abate quickly. If they were short-term, brief period of stress, resolution where you can recover from it, we wouldn't really have a problem. But the reality is that isn't the nature of modern day stress. And as a result, we get this thing that we call general adaptation syndrome. So what we're talking about here is a response process that results from this fight or flight kind of response, in which there are three stages: alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Here, let me advance to the actual chart. It's easier to talk about this way. This is a graphic representation of what's happening physiologically when you are presented with any sort of significant stressor, whether it's the classic historical stressor of predation, or the mundane modern day stressor of, geez, I really need to lose 10 pounds, or, my friends are being a-holes. Regardless, the initial stressor presents itself. Your body and your psyche have a response to it. That's the yellow in the general adaptation syndrome chart there, that we characterize as alarm. You have a physiological response to whatever the stressor is, and of course that varies in intensity, but you have a response nonetheless. What the graph is representing there, where you see an initial dip as the alarm presents itself, is what we see in response to any significant stress. And we talked about this real briefly when we talked about developmental psychology, and the stepwise approach to developmental progress. Essentially what this alarm, this little dip in the resistance to stress is representing is, you're progressing along. Something presents itself as a stressor, some challenge, and there's a moment of disorganization, hesitance, whatever, before your body figures out how to respond to it. We'll go back to you coming around that bend in the trail and confronting a grizzly bear. You're both going to have fundamentally the same initial response in that alarm stage. What I mean by that is you're going to come around the bend and see the grizzly bear, and in the moment that you see this large animate object, because your physiology is attuned, the physiology of the eye is attuned to be alert for movement. You might not even see the bear initially unless it moves. It does move. While your brain is processing the perceptual experience of that bear, you have a moment of disorganization. You're figuring out what's going on. And while that happens, generally what you have is a flinch. You withdraw. Interestingly, what's going on with the bear while you're having this very quick analysis of the situation is exactly the same thing. You come around a bend in the woods and you startle a grizzly bear, and the first thing a grizzly bear, the ultimate land predator in North America, there's nothing, well, other than human beings now, but over the course of the evolution of the grizzly bear in North America, nothing hunted it. It was the apex predator. It had nothing to be afraid of. But guess what? You startle a grizzly bear, you, scrawny little human, comes around and startles a bear that can very easily eat it. And the first thing the bear does reflexively is flinch. It's a universal mammalian response to something unforeseen. You withdraw and you assess. And that moment of flinching, of trying to figure out what's going on, orienting yourself, is what that little dip in the alarm segment of the general adaptation syndrome curve is referring to. So you have this, you have the stressor presents itself, you have a moment of disorganization, you figure out what's going on, you figure out how you're going to respond to it, and you begin to initiate that response. Of course, what's going on physiologically is that fight or flight response to some degree of intensity. If it's a fairly significant degree of intensity, what happens is the body has to begin to marshal additional resources so that you can sustain that fight or flight response. What I mean by that is, the bear scares you, which is appropriate, and you start breathing hard, and your heart rate speeds up, and your blood pressure goes up, and the liver releases glucose, which floods the muscles, which gets them ready to do their work of running, or if you're a fool, running. Your body prepares to respond to the threat. If, as happens in most cases, when you startle a bear, if you startle it from far enough away, it just runs away, even a grizzly bear. That's the best way to deal with an unknown threat, is you get away from it, even for an apex predator. And if that's the case, then gradually over time, the body settles down. This arousal autonomic nervous system response is countered and reversed, and calming occurs, and everything goes back to normal. If, however, that isn't the nature of the stress, if the stress does not go away, if the stress is, I don't have enough money to pay my bills, and that doesn't change, and it goes on for weeks and months, you continue at some level to have this basic stress response, because the bad news is, this is the only way that your body responds to stress. There's no second option. If you stress somebody out, they have this autonomic nervous system response. The problem is the autonomic nervous system response is designed to deal with short-term physical threats, not long-term financial threats or academic threats or social threats or potential threats. So the problem becomes, the problem arises really in two ways. The first one is that the physiological response is ill-suited to the stress that it's matched with. It's great if you're having to fight another person for survival. It's great if you're having to run away from somebody or something that's trying to hurt you. It isn't effective, increased heart rate, blood sugar, respiration rate, muscle tension, all these things. If the threat is, I don't have enough money to pay my bills, it's not doing you any good. Having a surge physiologically doesn't help you pay the bills. It does nothing to address the problem. If the stress doesn't go away, this becomes a very difficult thing to sustain. Your body has to continue to produce energy to feed all of this physiological activity. And so that's what we're talking about in the general adaptation syndrome when you're looking at that orange section of the graph there with it's called resistance. If that goes on long enough that that the physiology sustaining the response begins to become taxed, what eventually happens is you can't sustain the increased energy production, and you move into exhaustion where your body stops working as well. It becomes significantly less efficient. You begin to have problems. One of the reasons that this is the case is what is going on when you have a sympathetic as opposed to a parasympathetic nervous system response, this automatic response that you have. So you have a threat, you have a sympathetic automatic activating response. And basically what this is that your body marshals resources. It begins to break down molecules in the body to use as energy. We call this catabolism. The process is what we call catabolic, which is basically that we are breaking things down to use them for energy. There's nothing wrong with this as long as that process isn't unending. In fact, this can be productive. This is what you do if you go exercise, right? The process of exercise is catabolic. We're demanding something of the body. We're demanding an energy expenditure. That works very well if you get a parasympathetic response afterwards. You have this catabolic period of activity where you are demanding something in excess of what your body is capable of dealing with. Hopefully, this is a eustress. Hopefully, this is a healthy stressor that you feel capable of responding to. You break down molecules in your body to use as energy. After the exercise is done, you go, if you're smart, you go eat some protein, eat some fat, maybe some carbohydrates, make sure you get some good sleep, get some active rest, walking or that sort of thing. And basically what you're doing is you're promoting a parasympathetic nervous system response. You're helping your body calm back down so that it can shift from catabolism to anabolism, to an anabolic response. An anabolic just means that we're taking molecules and we're combining them to build new tissue and store energy. This is what we're talking about when we talk about anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids are the mechanism by which steroids work is basically to help you respond more quickly, recover more quickly to exercise. You heal more quickly from the catabolic effects of whatever your exercise is. So that's the issue here with the general adaptation syndrome chart, is that the fight or flight response, that sympathetic nervous system response, is catabolic. You're breaking down molecules. In some cases, in many cases, you're breaking down tissue. If you go exercise, you actually are breaking down some of the muscular tissue in the body. If you don't have the opportunity for your body to calm down, if you don't have that parasympathetic, subsequent parasympathetic response, calming response, you don't ever get a chance for your body to recover from whatever the damage was from the fight or flight response. So the important thing is that you need this cycle of a parasympathetic nervous system response after the activation. Otherwise, what happens is you end up in that exhaustion phase of the adaptation syndrome. So I've talked around this. Let me kind of go through real quickly what we're talking about, what's going on physiologically. You have a stress event. You have a cortical analysis. The problem-solving part of your brain analyzes the threat. If the threat is perceived to be pertinent, if it's real, if it doesn't resolve immediately, the hypothalamus activates and floods the body with various hormones and neurotransmitters, epinephrine and adrenaline and noradrenaline, that kickstart all this. It's like you get an adrenaline surge. Everybody has experienced this. It's the fight or flight response. If the threat is sustained for long enough, what happens after the initial surge is that the adrenal glands, as the epinephrine, adrenaline, and norepinephrine, noradrenaline, begin to peter out as the immediate supply begins to diminish. The adrenal glands are cued by the hypothalamus to release cortisol. And what cortisol does, in part, predominantly, is to sustain that production of the chemicals that allow your body to remain aroused, to remain in the fight or flight response. The problem is that cortisol produces a range of effects. One of the things that it's doing, the way that it sustains the fight or flight response, is that it's the mechanism that is telling the rest of your body, the reproductive system, the immune system, digestion, these kind of things, to kind of power down. It's taking the energy that you would use to digest your food, for example, and shifting that energy over into this immediate response to the threat. One of the other things that it does is that it's laying the groundwork to increase your appetite. And of course, the reason that it's doing that is because the whole system is designed, okay, we're going to deal with this threat. Because this threat is longer term, because we're having to use a cortisol response to sustain the fight or flight system, we better be in a position to repair the damage after this is all done. Repair the damage basically means sleep and eat. So it's cortisol. One of the things cortisol does, this is why cortisol in sustained stress is such a problem, is it makes you hungry. You want to eat because your brain is saying, okay, well, we're using all this energy. We need to take in calories to recover from it. So in addition to the fact that cortisol is setting your body up for recovery by preparing your body to be hungry and tired once the stressor resolves, hopefully. It's doing a couple of other things too. As long as the cortisol is being released, it is increasing sensitivity to adrenaline, and that's so that you don't have to produce and use so much adrenaline to get the same effect. But that's a downside in the long term, because if you have a sustained cortisol response, in other words, if you have sustained stress and your body is continuing to produce this sympathetic nervous system response, continuing to produce cortisol, is what you're doing is you're making your body more and more long-term sensitive to adrenaline. It doesn't take as much to stress you out. The other thing it's doing is that it's working to sustain the blood flow, the percentage of glucose in the bloodstream. It's wanting to keep blood sugar high. And if you know anything about insulin and diabetes, that becomes a problem long term in terms of body composition. It inclines the body long term to store calories taken in as fat. And basically because your body is preparing constantly for additional stress, for additional threats. And the way the body responds to that is, boy, we better make sure we have some energy available. So any option we've got for storing calories, let's store it in reserve. Let's store it as body fat. If things go well, in other words, if the stress that you're responding to resolves, and the whole system proceeds as it was evolved to proceed with short-term threats, threat goes away, you have a cortical assessment of that, the problem-solving part of your brain goes, okay, yep, the threat is gone. Excess cortisol levels, now that the threat is no longer an issue, are detected by the hippocampus, and that hippocampus signals the pituitary gland via the hypothalamus to essentially turn off the adrenal glands, to power down the adrenal glands so that you're not getting adrenaline and cortisol continually released into the body. That powering down of that part of the whole system is part of what kickstarts the parasympathetic nervous system response, and everything calms down. In practical terms, your heart rate settles, your respiration rate settles, you start to breathe more slowly, muscle tension diminishes, you start to relax, and you start to shift from a catabolic process, breaking things down to use an energy, to an anabolic process. Let's build things back up. This transition from the sympathetic nervous system response, the arousal, fight or flight response, to the parasympathetic nervous system response is absolutely vital for health. That's part of what we're talking about here today, is what happens with this stress response, especially if it is sustained. You need to have a good balance between sympathetic and nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system response, because of the importance of so many of the things that happens on the that are mediated by the parasympathetic nervous system. You can remember these things by the acronym SLUD. The processes that are mediated by the parasympathetic nervous system are sexual arousal, salivation, so the beginning of the digestive process, lacrimation, which is the production of tears, urination, digestion, and defecation. If you are perpetually in a sympathetic nervous system response, an arousal, fight or flight response, what you get is dysfunction around sexual arousal, salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. You get constipated, you get stomach problems, your ability to function sexually and your interest in functioning sexually diminish. If those parts of your life are valuable to you, and they are, whether you realize it or not, digestion is an example. If you disrupt the parasympathetic process of digestion, not only are you setting yourself up to have gastrointestinal problems, constipation, gas, stomach aches, these kinds of things, but you're also mucking with the process by which your body uses and stores energy. Essentially what you're doing is you're encouraging your body to take the calories that it isn't expending to move your body around, that it isn't expending in just day-to-day activity. You're encouraging your body to preserve some of those calories, to take them away from the processes of day-to-day activity and store them as body fat, so they're available for the next bout of stress. So you get this process if you inhibit the parasympathetic nervous system response, where you not only do you have the stomach aches and the constipation and all that kind of stuff, but you also have the increased production of body fat. So we're talking about the problems that are created by a sustained sympathetic arousing autonomic nervous system response. What happens if you remain stressed? And the reason why we're talking about this is because that's the nature of modern life, right? We talk about the stressors that we face in modern life, essentially by categorizing them into three categories. The first one, which we call acute, is kind of like the foundational category. What we're talking about here is essentially stress itself. You're presented with something that is a challenge, that is a stressor. The current demands, anticipated demands, the recently resolved demands, things that you're rehearsing in your mind or excuse me, reviewing in your mind. This just happened, because those things, of course, can stress you out, things that have happened in the past. But acute stress is essentially, I am presented with a challenge that has to be dealt with. Presumably, it is dealt with and it resolves. So acute would be short-term challenge. The problem is that this is, of course, you're not in a situation where you get your one stressor per day, you resolve it, and you spend the rest of the day recovering, right? For many people, maybe most people, the day is going from one stressor to another stressor to another stressor to another stressor, and that's what we call episodic acute stress. This is your life, right? This is you going from one class where there's a quiz to another class that's just boring you to tears, to another class where you've got a paper due that you didn't get a chance to get done, or you get sent home and you got to do all your classes online and listen to somebody ramble on electronically. At least you can turn this one off and pause this, right? But the transition from one challenge to another challenge to another challenge that you may not be choosing, because remember, if you're choosing the challenge, if you're engaging and you want the challenge, we would call that eustress, and it fundamentally has a different response. It causes a different response in the body. When we're talking about episodic acute stress, it's the serial presentation of challenges that we don't necessarily feel capable of dealing with. This is largely a lifestyle issue. It becomes habitual. And the reality is, it is chosen, right? Like, you're living the life you're living right now. The episodic acute stressors that you experience because you have chosen this life. You've chosen to become a student. Not that there aren't factors in that choice. You may not necessarily feel like this was your choice. Maybe you got pressure from your parents. Maybe you have dreams of someday being wealthy, and you see college as a stepping stone in that direction. All that may be the case. There may be variables, but you chose this. You chose this episodic acute stress. And the reality is, if you don't choose this episodic acute stress, you very likely will be choosing another episodic acute stress situation. Say you leave college and you say, oh, I'll work in a bar or a restaurant. I make good money as a bartender. Well, if you've ever worked as a bartender, not an easy job, very stressful. The reality is that the modern lifestyle tends to be this serial experience of one stressor after another, with very limited time in between to recover. What you get from that are people who, frankly, look stressed. Generally over-aroused, generally tense. And remember what I said before about how being in this sustained sympathetic nervous system's aroused state, one, it predisposes you to be more sensitive to stress, more sensitive, for example, to the adrenaline response, but it also primes your brain to be more danger sensitive. So what happens is, as you spend more and more time in this sympathetic nervous system, this aroused response, is you become the stress response becomes more and more and more ingrained, and you become more and more and more kind of tuned in to being stressed. and you're more likely then to respond to things that otherwise wouldn't be stressful as if they are stressful, right? Because you've become so practiced in this stress response. And once it gets to the point where you're starting to treat social situations, interpersonal relationships that would otherwise not necessarily be stressful as if they are, you're short-tempered and irritable with people, well, what does that do? If it wasn't stressful to begin with, and you react in a grumpy way, it sure as hell is going to become stressful pretty quickly as the people push back against you being grumpy, right? And that's the typical presentation of somebody who's kind of immersed in episodic acute stress and not handling it well. Generally, if you see long-term immersion in episodic acute stress, you generally getting that from one of two types of people. Either you got like the achievement-focused, driven type A personality, or you get somebody who is what we call a pessimistic worrier. That they're creating stress even in situations where the stress is not a realistic factor. It's not the stress is not real. It's not objective. It's their perception of the situation. And the pessimistic worrier personality can develop from long-term exposure, say like in childhood, long-term exposure to that stressful environment, a violent environment or an environment where there's constant discord or the threat of danger, this sort of thing. This episodic acute cycle of one stressor after another that essentially sustains the sympathetic nervous system response with very little opportunity to recover is what leads to that exhaustion response in the general adaptation syndrome graph that I showed you earlier. The signs that you're kind of immersed in this episodic acute stress cycle are the things that you see on the slide there. I'm not going to go through everything. Let's see, I'm trying to think if there's anything I want to make sure I explain to you. We already talked a little bit about the sympathetic nervous system response diverting blood flow from the organs, including the digestive system, and that causing all sorts of problems: heartburn, stomach pain, nausea, appetite disruption. And then we talked also about the weight gain because of what's going on with the insulin response as a result of this constant adrenaline release, or the need for the constant adrenaline release, which leads to the production of cortisol. And the production of cortisol sustains high blood glucose levels. And when you get high blood glucose levels over a long period of time, what ends up happening is you start to change the way your body handles calories. It's kind of interesting because you can actually look at somebody, and within reason, you can tell by looking at them whether they have been subject to exposure to episodic acute stress for an extended period of time. If they have, what you tend to see in males is the spare tire around the belly and the love handles, so to speak. If you have a sustained cortisol response for males, you get this storage of fat around the midsection. In females, you get it kind of in that love handle area above the hips, and in the lower belly and in the buttocks. You can tell by looking at somebody whether or not they're experiencing the stress because of that pattern of fat storage that you get from an extended elevation of cortisol. And then, of course, obviously, with a sustained arousal, the sustained stress, you measure sleep. Additionally, dizziness. Obviously, if you're messing up your sleep long term, you're going to have problems with energy. We already talked about the fact that that part of what the sympathetic nervous system response is doing is shifting energy away from certain processes, and that's the reason why you get things like libido, which is sex drive. Sex drive diminishes because if the physiological processes that's going on in your body is to just keep you alive, and that's the fight or flight response, just keep me alive, you're not worried about reproduction. The energy doesn't need to go to reproduction because you don't know whether they're going to survive to be able to reproduce. So energy is diverted away from that, and you experience impotence, diminished libido, etc. And then we get also, of course, the psychological symptoms of episodic acute stress, which of course is exactly what you need when you're in school. Things like difficulty concentrating, distractibility, trouble learning new information, memory problems, these kinds of things. And a lot of these things are tied to the fact that extended hyperarousal, extended arousal associated with the sympathetic nervous system response disrupts your sleep. You disrupt your sleep, you create working memory deficits like we talked about earlier in the semester. So that episodic acute stress process and the consequences of it physiologically and psychologically, cognitively, are bad enough. But the reality is there's a fairly exceptional, reasonably unusual next level of stress that we talk about as chronic stress. Chronic stress is kind of a worst case scenario sort of a situation. This is a stress situation that the person cannot find their way out of. It's unrelenting. It doesn't stop. Episodic acute is stressor, brief period where you don't have a stressor, brief period where you don't have a stressor, where it's coming at you fast and furious. But you are getting brief periods where you get to have at least a reduced level of stress for a few minutes, maybe for a few hours. Chronic stress is a situation where you are being exposed to stress and there is no abatement. There's no break. And you don't see any way of getting out of it, and you can't manage it. You can't. There's nothing you can do to address it. This is things like living in a profoundly dysfunctional family system, especially ones where there is some physical danger, or in some cases some very significant psychological danger where there's really profound psychological abuse that's taking place. You can have the same kind of thing in a marriage situation. In extraordinary circumstances, you can get the same thing in some job situations, in some job settings. And then additionally, you have circumstances like exposure to war, racism, true poverty. When I'm talking about poverty, I'm talking about not enough to eat, no place to sleep, no access to clean water, these kinds of, we're talking pretty profound poverty. And then, of course, additionally, we have that circumstance that we talked about earlier in which a person lives in the early part of their life, his or her life, in circumstances in which they are exposed to sustained trauma, physical abuse, sexual abuse, severe psychological abuse, that disposes them physiologically and psychologically to see the world as a threat. So that even when they're removed from those circumstances, they're still having a sympathetic nervous system response, despite the fact that the circumstance is no longer warranted. This often results in erroneous beliefs that cause the stress response to be sustained regardless of the circumstances. If you're living in relatively safe circumstances after growing up in a really, really traumatizing environment, you get removed from it either by just growing up and getting away from it, or being removed and put into a foster family that's actually a decent family. If you were in that traumatizing environment for long enough, it may have sufficiently kind of brainwashed you essentially into seeing the world as malicious, even when it's not. You're so tuned into danger that you get this with kids who have been abused. They're removed, they're put into circumstances where we're trying to help them. Say you get a therapist or a social worker in who actually is well-intentioned and wants to help. And they reach out to the kid, literally or figuratively, and the child's response to a helping hand being reached out is to recoil, because they're so programmed to anything extended to you is aggressive and hostile. And I mean that literally and figuratively. So you reach out, these kids who have been raised in traumatic environments, you reach out, say you literally reach out to gesture to them or to put a hand on them is to try to comfort them. And like a beaten dog, their tendency is to recoil and to flinch. If you are kind to them, what their brain is saying is, why is this person being kind to me? The presumption is that you're setting me up. You're manipulating me. They have this erroneous fundamental belief that the world is a malicious place, that you're out to get me. Additionally, chronic stress is present with severe mental illness, some personality disorders, schizophrenia, this kind of thing. Cognitive disability, what we used to call mental retardation. I think this one gets overlooked frequently. One of the things that struck me when I used to work with people with cognitive disability was that while they are, by definition, cognitively disabled, not as cognitively capable, not as smart as the average person. I had one adult that I worked with who had a cognitive disability and a fairly serious mental illness say to me one time that I may be retarded, but I'm not stupid. And what he was trying to say was that despite his cognitive disability, he was very aware of how people saw him. Imagine being a person with a significant cognitive disability, because by and large, when a person has a significant cognitive disability, when they meet the criteria for what we used to call mental retardation, an IQ 2 standard deviations below the average IQ, which is very impaired. Not infrequently, you can tell that the person is impaired by looking at them. It's physically apparent, not inevitably, but frequently. And certainly after you interact with somebody who is in that cognitively disabled range, pretty quickly you can assess that that's where they are. Those people, by and large, are not going to get married. They're not going to date. They're not going to hold jobs. They're not going to go graduate from, they might graduate from high school with a special education degree. They're not going to graduate from college. Imagine what it's like living in a world where you're the low man on the totem pole all the time. The likelihood that you're going to get married is virtually zero. The likelihood you're going to find somebody willing to date you is very, very, very small. The likelihood you're ever going to hold a job of any significance where you're going to get compensated with anything approaching a living wage is virtually zero. That would be profoundly stressful. And the true curse of this is, while they're cognitively impaired, while the majority of people that are in this category are cognitively impaired, they're not so cognitively impaired that they don't realize the circumstances they're in. That's the curse. Additionally, people with autistic spectrum disorders, essentially autism is a vulnerability to stress. The things that autism is essentially, my nervous system is working sufficiently differently from most people that the day-to-day demands of life are very, very, very stressful for me. The things that other people take for granted, reading social cues, being able to sit still and not be physically uncomfortable from sitting still. Things that we don't even, the neurotypical, the person whose nervous system works pretty normally, doesn't even notice, are profoundly burdensome to somebody with autistic spectrum disorder. The day-to-day life of functioning in what they call a neurotypical world, the world designed for people whose nervous systems work within a certain range of normalcy, is profoundly stressful for them. And then, of course, additionally, in terms of chronic stressors, chronic pain, pain that's significant and unrelenting, debilitating illness, long-term cancer diagnosis, chronic illnesses in general that interfere with your ability to function and be comfortable in your daily life, sleep well, these kinds of things. Chronic stress kills people. Well, one, because people sometimes get to the point where I can't take this anymore and they suicide. It kills by destroying the body. You maintain a sympathetic nervous system response long enough, and you become vulnerable to heart attack, stroke, disorders of inflammation, so things like arthritis, cancer, and these kinds of things. Chronic stress beats you down and tears you up. And the really tragic thing about it is the people who live in those circumstances often don't even see that they're extraordinary circumstances. They're so used to life that is absolutely intolerable that the idea that life can be any other way is almost unimaginable to them. In those circumstances, intervention is not easy. How we deal with chronic stress is one of the main profound challenges of modern life. There really are no easy answers when it comes to dealing with chronic stress. But most of us, most of the time, are not being exposed to chronic stress. We're being exposed to, at minimum, acute stress, occasional addressable stress, or episodic acute stress, which is kind of a lifestyle sort of a thing. What do we do about it? How do we prevent this whole process from becoming destructive? When we talk about dealing with stress in terms of the term we use is coping. The nice psychobabble-y definition for coping is dynamic implementation of behavioral, emotional, and cognitive strategies for understanding and responding to stressful stimuli. So basically, this is what do you do to prevent a sustained sympathetic nervous system response? How do you kickstart the parasympathetic response? That's what we're talking about when we talk about it. So what we know is that at least as important as the stress itself is how we respond to it. The strategies that we use or don't use to cope with stress are at least as important as whatever the stressor itself is. If your response to stress is avoidance, you don't deal with the stress. You minimize it. You try to pretend like it's not there. You distract yourself. What you generally get is a sustained cortisol response, a sustained, because the stress isn't being dealt with. It's still there, and every time you stop avoiding it, there it waits for you. The things that we use in terms of avoidance is drinking, drug use. If you're stressed out, somebody comes, oh, I need a beer, or somebody's their way of coping with stress is daily marijuana use, sexual activity as a distraction, losing themselves in binging multiple seasons of television shows on Netflix. Even, we talk about reading as a good thing, but if reading is compulsive, if you spend all your time reading detective novels or fantasy novels as a way of not having to deal with the problems around you, it becomes avoidance. I'm not arguing against any of these things with the exception of illegal drug use. I'm not arguing against these things used occasionally. Using a little bit of television or some reading or occasionally going out and having a good time and having some drinks with friends, this kind of thing. Short-term occasional avoidance isn't necessarily bad, but if it becomes your primary way of coping, what the problem is that, well, it's like people talk about, the old saying is that the problem with drinking as a way of handling your problems is that after you sober up, the problem is still there and now you got a hangover, right? It isn't an effective way of dealing with the problem. Conversely, if you use what we call approach coping, this is essentially problem focused. This is, we're presented with a stressor and we respond to it by saying, okay, what can I do to fix this situation? What can I do either to reduce the level of stress, reduce the demands, or change the environment in some way, or improve my ability to cope with the stress? Generally speaking, people who, when we look at this in research, people who respond to stress through this approach method of coping tend to be more physically and psychologically healthy. The approach coping strategy is, I have this problem. How am I going to change it? How am I going to fix it? Or how am I going to become more capable of fixing it? And of course, if that is your mindset, what you're doing is you're fostering what we would call a sense of agency. And what all that means is that you feel capable of affecting your environment. And when a person feels capable of affecting their environment, stress is reduced, anxiety is reduced. Let's face it, anxiety is in part, I can't do anything about this. I can't be safe. I can't protect myself. I can't respond successfully, and therefore I feel anxious. If you have developed a sense of competence, a sense that I can successfully impact my environment, then by and large what you get is a reduction in anxiety. Now, this approach coping strategy tends to work only when the stressor is something that can actually be controlled. It can actually be overcome or addressed. There are situations where the stressor can't be controlled, can't necessarily be influenced, can't change the environment, you can't do something to resolve it. In that circumstance, it might be appropriate to resort to what we call emotion-focused coping. And emotion-focused coping is basically concerned more with managing how you respond psychologically and emotionally to a stressor rather than dealing with the stressor itself. So it's supposing I can't do anything about the situation, so I need to manage how I respond to, how I tolerate the situation. This can actually be fairly productive, particularly if the circumstances are not life-threatening or complete or catastrophic. Reflecting and kind of rehearsing the idea that, you know what, can't really do anything to fix this. It isn't going to damage me. It isn't life-threatening. It isn't catastrophic. It isn't going to destroy my life. Perhaps the best way for me to deal with this is to take a deep breath, take a step back, and accept it. That would be, and there are circumstances where that isn't an appropriate response. You know, situations where the stressor is really a dangerous situation or really a truly intolerable situation. That emotion-focused coping can also be problematic if it transitions into spending a lot of time thinking about how miserable I feel as a result of this stressor, or how helpless I am in dealing with this stressor. I feel terrible. I can't do anything about this, which makes me feel terrible. And so you end up in this feedback loop where you're just ruminating. You're just worrying and kind of wallowing in it, right? So emotion-focused coping isn't necessarily bad or good. It's a matter of kind of where it takes you. Does it take you to acceptance or negative rumination? We also, when we talk about this emotion-focused coping, we also talk about kind of a subtype that we call emotional approach coping. And this is in part what we do in psychotherapy, and it is essentially the process of thinking carefully about how am I responding emotionally and psychologically to this stressor, and then expressing it. And in this case, expressing it is, if you're going to do it in an effective way, which is what we're looking at when we talk about emotional approach coping. Effective ways of expressing the emotion tend to be verbal. So what you're looking at is you're processing to yourself. This is the stressor. You're reflecting on, how am I responding to this? How is this stressor affecting me? How do I feel about it? And then if you're doing this in psychotherapy, you're of course doing this in conversation with somebody, and that therapist is probably going to ask you, how do you feel about this? And of course, the psychotherapy situation requires that you're talking through with the person, you're explaining to the person, well, actually, I feel, and you lay out exactly what it is, and the therapist is probably going to ask you some details about how do you feel about this. And what we find is that expressing verbally how you feel actually helps to reduce the experience of stress. And there's a variety of reasons why this is the case that are kind of beyond the scope of this class. You can do that in psychotherapy with another person, or you can do that individually, where you're thinking in terms of what exactly is going on that is stressful, how am I responding to it, and then the expression part of it. We talk about this all the time when you talk about how do you cope with stress. People who cope with it by journaling, writing, like writing fiction, this kind of thing. Painting, drawing, music, all of those things are ways of expressing what's going on internally, right? So an emotional approach coping would be spending time reflecting on the stressor, how it's affecting me emotionally, and then expressing that emotional response in some way. Emotional approach coping is not screaming and yelling, cursing, weeping and gnashing of teeth, punching people, acting out kind of thing. It's where you've given it some thought and you're carefully expressing, careful isn't the right word really. You're being conscientious about how you express it. You're being thoughtful about how you express the emotion. One of the things I think is interesting, if you've ever been exposed to Alcoholics Anonymous, you might be familiar with the serenity prayer that they use, which is, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Well, if you think about it, the approach coping, or the problem-focused coping, and the emotion-focused coping are the first two lines. If I can't do anything about it, help me accept it. And if I can do something about it, give me the courage to actually fix it. So these ways of coping with stress are not, the names might be relatively new as people have studied them psychologically, but the ideas behind it are actually fairly old, older than the serenity prayer itself. So let's talk a little bit about kind of in more practical terms. How do we actually cope? What do we actually do? There are some things, concrete, objective things that we know work. We have good empirical, there's research data to indicate that they work. And essentially they work by focusing on reducing that sympathetic nervous system response. And we do it by essentially countering it with various physical and psychological practices. We're going to talk real quick about relaxation, breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, visualization, and mindfulness. All four of these things have some common, what we call common factors. They have some things in common with one another. In order for these things to work, you got to set up the right circumstances. The first thing is you set up an environment where stimulation is minimal. You get into a quiet place. preferably a place that's fairly pleasant. Oftentimes what we will do when we're teaching somebody these stress coping strategies is we'll ask them, we'll say, go pick a place in your home and take some time and some care to set it up in a way that you like. Make a room in your house very, very pleasant. This doesn't necessarily take a lot of money. It might be things like, one, make sure the place is clean and orderly. Maybe little things like put a comfortable chair in there. I don't know, light a candle, light some incense, make it smell good. Pay some attention to the lighting. Make it a pleasant. Some people like bright, well-lit rooms. Other people like kind of a lower level of lighting. Some people like natural light. Some people like. Pay attention to these things. Make sure the room temperature is nice. If you have certain artwork or decoration that you like, take some time to decorate the room in a way that you find pleasant. Hopefully find a place that you can control how noisy it is, how busy it is. Set up the situation so you can, basically what we're doing is we're trying to set up a place where we can escape day-to-day stressors. And we want to make the place that we're going as physically comfortable as possible. That's get a comfortable chair. It might be your bedroom. It might be setting up a situation where you can lay on your bed and, I don't know, draw your blinds and light a candle or make something, have something that makes your room smell good and put on some nice soft music or something like that. So we want to have reduced stress stimulation, physically comfortable. And then we're going to ask people with these four strategies to focus their attention in what we call a passive and non-judgmental attitude. And we'll talk about why that's the case here in just a minute. When we teach people to do these things, we generally do so when we teach relaxation breathing, when we teach meditation, progressive muscle relaxation, we follow certain steps. And the first thing we do is we just do the initial training. We teach them what the process is. And then we sit with a person. I'm talking about doing this in psychotherapy. Then we sit with a person and we'll actually have them practice or rehearse this thing with us in the therapy room. We'll actually go through and practice the relaxation breathing, sometimes over the course of a number of sessions. And then what we do is we give them kind of the homework of going home, setting up the situation in their house, and practicing it at home. And then if they're going to use it to manage stress in a stressful situation, say you've got somebody who has social anxiety, and we're going to use relaxation breathing to help manage that anxiety. We teach them the relaxation breathing. We have them practice it at home, and then we have them, okay, we're gonna have you go. We're gonna have you go to the grocery store, and perhaps their social anxiety is sufficient that even the process of interacting with the checkout person at the grocery store is anxiety provoking for them. So what we might do is after they've had an opportunity to practice this relaxation breathing, as an example, we would send them to the grocery store, which they're reporting to us as a stressful but not terrible situation. And we'll have them prior to checkout to take a couple of minutes and practice the breathing to bring down their level of psychological and physiological arousal before they actually step up to the checkout lane. And perhaps we might be talking to them about thinking in terms of taking deep breaths and slowing the breathing down, even as they're interacting with the checker, for example. If the stress is really extraordinary in that circumstance, they really have, even to just something like checking out at the grocery store, their anxiety response is really, really profound. What we might do as an intermediate step is, rather than sending them to the grocery store, is we might have them in their comfortable place at home, their happy place at home on their bed, with their candle lit, and, nice quiet music. We might have them repeatedly over the course of a couple of weeks imagine the checkout circumstances while they're doing their relaxation breathing, until eventually they can imagine those circumstances and not have a strong anxiety response. They've gotten used to it. And then we might send them to the store and not necessarily give them the assignment of you have to go do the checkout lane, Maybe they would go and they would just use the breathing exercise in anticipation as they're thinking about checking out, and they're free to leave without actually checking out. The idea is they're able to get in that environment and control their anxiety by using the breathing. This is the implementation in low stress, real life contexts. And then eventually what we wanted to have them do is be able to use these strategies in the circumstances that precipitated the need for the strategies. Social anxiety situations, athletic situations, classroom situations, that sort of thing. So these 4 strategies, what are we talking about? They're actually remarkably simple. The first one, which is the basis for all the other ones, is relaxation breathing. And basically what we know is the whole autonomic nervous system response, the fluctuation from the sympathetic nervous system response to the parasympathetic nervous system response, is mediated in large part by a big nerve that comes basically out of the base of the brain and runs right down the middle of your torso, and has branches that go out to your heart, your lungs, all of your organs, your intestines, your liver, your kidneys. The vagus actually means wandering. The vagus nerve wanders in the sense that it's connected to everything in your torso and other parts of your body. And what we know is that if a person is stressed out, and we say to this person, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to take a nice deep breath. When they do that, the vagus nerve lights up. You take one breath, nice, slow, deep, and controlled breath, and the vagus nerve sends a signal throughout your entire body, initiating the parasympathetic response, the calming response. And so the thinking behind the relaxation breathing is, you can't close your eyes and just force of will cause a parasympathetic response. You can't close your eyes and slow your heart. You can't close your eyes and concentrate and lower your blood pressure. But you can close your eyes and control your breathing. And if you control your breathing, you slow your breathing down, your heart rate will slow. Obviously your respiration rate slows because you can't control that. But your heart rate will slow, your blood pressure will reduce, muscle tension relaxes. So you can initiate a parasympathetic nervous system response just by controlling your breathing. We talk about the way we teach relaxation breathing is the one I use is what we call cubed breathing. Very, very simple. It feels like, oh, there should be so much more involved in this, but actually it's literally as simple as counting your breaths. And what we do in cubed breathing or box breathing, usually we'll say to somebody, I want you to take 4 times a day, I want you to take 4 deep breaths. And when you take each breath, I want you to break that breath into 4 parts. And I want you to count to 4 during each of these 4 parts. I want you to close your eyes and breathe in through your nose as you count to 4. I want you to hold your breath for a count of 4. I want you to breathe out for a count of 4. And then I want you to sit kind of empty and relaxed for a count of 4. So as you're doing this, it would look like that. And actually, as you're teaching somebody this, you would actually model this for them. So you'd say, okay, I want you to count in your head as you're doing this. So I want you to breathe through your nose, close your eyes and breathe through your nose, breathe in through your nose, hold it, breathe out through your mouth, and sit empty and relaxed, counting to 4 each time. So you go like this. And that's 1 breath. And we're going to do that 4 times. Each time as you breathe in, 1, 2, 3, 4. As you hold it, 1, 2, 3, 4. As you breathe out, 1, 2, 3, 4. And as you sit empty, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, until you get to 4 breaths. Now, 4 is somewhat arbitrary. You can use 5, you can use 6, you can use 8. The idea is we want somebody to consciously slow down their breathing. We're using the counting in part to get them to slow down their breathing, but we're also using the counting to occupy their mind, right? You can slow down your breathing, but if you're just worried about everything that's going on around you, it actually isn't going to cause this relaxation response. So we're having them count so that they don't think about anything else. It's actually it's a kind of the beginning of meditation, really. And so, you can do this you can do a 4-count breath like this 4 times a day. You can do a 4-count breath like this 10 times a day. You can, as you become comfortable with this, in fact, one of the things that we tell people is, if you get to the point where this breathing in through your nose and holding it and breathing out through your mouth and sitting empty for a count of 4 on each part of the breath is comfortable, maybe slow it down a little bit more. Maybe count to 5. And people who practice this regularly will tell you, they can count to 8 or even 10. That the process, they're breathing so slowly that they're taking one breath in almost a minute. And their heart rate goes way, way down. They calm way down. And that, of course, that takes practice. But this process it is literally that simple. Counting your breaths, focusing on being very aware of breathing in through your nose, holding it, breathing out through your mouth, and sitting relaxed and empty. You may have picked up on this as I was telling you the different ways you can do it. It isn't so important. The details about how many breaths am I taking and how fast am I taking them and how many times a day, the details aren't so important. The important thing is that you are actually doing something in this ballpark, that you are doing the slowing down of the breathing and you're doing it multiple times a day. The reality is, it feels actually, if you go and you sit down and you do this, most people will notice, it actually does feel pretty good. It's relaxing, it's pleasant to do. That being said, most of us don't spend much time doing it. We just don't. It takes effort and energy to get yourself to take a moment out of your day and make yourself do it. And unfortunately, the reality is that relaxation breathing works. How well relaxation breathing works corresponds to how regularly you are practicing it. The more times you do it in a day, the better it works. So if you're doing it 10 times a day and you do it for a month, what you will notice at the end of the month is your overall stress level is significantly reduced. You feel better, you're less irritable, you sleep better, etc., etc. I know that seems like quite a claim for just breathing, but it actually really does work if you practice it on a regular basis. The next step up from relaxation breathing is what we call progressive muscle relaxation. And this is basically, okay, you teach somebody basic relaxation breathing, and then you add in progressive relaxation of voluntary muscles. So essentially what you're doing is, as you're having somebody breathe, you're having them think about various muscle groups in their body and relaxing them. So for example, I might say, okay, I want you to lay down or sit in a comfortable chair, and I want you to breathe in through your nose, hold it, breathe out through your mouth, and sit empty. Same thing as there is in the relaxation breathing. But as you breathe in, I want you to tighten up certain muscle groups. So it might be, at the beginning, it might be just as simple as you have them put their hands in their lap, and as they breathe in, they squeeze their fists, not so tight that their hands hurt or cramp, but just into firm fists. As they breathe in, and then as they breathe out, you have them relax their hands. So, right? So you can do this with just the hands, or progressive muscle relaxation. What we often have them do is we'll have them lay down or sit down, and we'll say, okay, I want you to breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And the first time you take a breath, I want you to concentrate on your feet. And when you breathe in, I want you to tighten up your feet. And when you breathe out, I want you to relax your feet. And on the next breath, I want you to tighten up your calves. And as you breathe out, I want you to release your calves. And on the next breath, when you tighten up, when you take your breath in, I want you to tighten up the muscles in your thighs. And when you breathe out, I want you to relax them. And so on and so on. And working, that's one way of doing it, where you work from the bottom up through the body. And then perhaps, and you might, there's all sorts of different ways of doing it. You can do it muscle group by muscle group. You can say muscle group by muscle group, and then when you get to it, like say you did your feet, you did your calves, you did your thighs, and the muscles in the buttocks and hips, And then once you've gotten up to the belly button, perhaps you say, okay, I want you to tighten up all the muscles in the lower part of your body and then relax them. And you might do that for a couple of breaths before you move on to the rest of the body. All sorts of different ways you can do this. And basically the idea here is that we know that when you're having this consistent sympathetic arousing nervous system response, that one of the corresponding parts of it, in addition to high blood pressure and increased heart rate and all that kind of stuff, is muscle tension. And so what we're doing is we're having the person be aware of which muscle groups are holding tension and consciously relaxing them. And the same thing is the case with this as with the relaxation breathing. It actually is a fairly pleasant thing to do. In fact, sometimes people will find themselves falling asleep when they do it. It's fairly pleasant to do, but it only works as well as you practice it. You got to make sure you're doing it on a daily basis in order for it to really be effective. If this sounds like something that you're like, oh, okay, that actually, I got tension headaches, or I got tension in my neck, or I got a lot of aches and pains that I know are stress related. If you're thinking that way, I'll tell you, you can go on YouTube and there are more videos than you could ever possibly watch. Some of them, I'll tell you, are really cheesy, where they're actually talking you through the muscle relaxation. I put up a link to one, at least it used to be there, I haven't checked the link recently, that was a reasonably decent one. I would say if you want to try it, go through, find a video that works, and then just make it a couple times a day. Lay there and go through the practice. Again, it works as well as you practice it. You got to do it on a daily basis. Visualization, again, starts with relaxation breathing. But visualization, there's a couple of different ways you can do this. One is that we're asking the person, as they're doing their relaxation breathing, to imagine a setting or a situation that they find to be very relaxing. So like for me, when I'll do this, sometimes if I can't sleep, I'll do this, is I'll do the breathing in through the nose, hold it, out through the mouth, sit empty and relaxed, or lay down empty and relaxed. And as I do it, I'll picture a beach scene, right? I'll imagine myself a particular beach in Florida, white sand, blue skies, warm sun, crystal clear water, waves crashing on the beach. I'm sitting in my beach chair. I've got myself a nice cold beer in my hand. I've got my umbrella over me. I can see the sand on my feet. I can smell the sunscreen on my skin. I can smell the ocean air. I can hear the seagulls squawking. I can actually, my feet are actually sticking out from under the shade of the umbrella. I can feel the heat of the sun on them. I can feel the sand between my toes. I can feel the breeze on my face. A little bit of sweat coming down the back of my neck. You're picturing, not just picturing, visualization is actually, the visualization is the term that we use, but visualization is probably actually not the best description, because you're not just creating a picture in your head, you're filling in all of the sensory experience, right? So you're not just picturing what the beach looks like, you're imagining the smells and the sounds, and I might take a taste of my beer. Every sensory experience that is involved, you're trying to recreate it in your head as you're slowing your breathing. And I'll tell you, using this to foster sleep onset, with a little bit of practice, you can get very, very good at going to sleep this way. It actually works really, really well. It does take practice, just like with the relaxation breathing, just like with the progressive muscle relaxation. You do it one time, it's going to feel pretty nice. It might be a pleasant experience. It becomes progressively more effective the more you do it. Another way that we use visualization is as a way of handling stress or pain. And I'll give you the example that we use for pain. Say if somebody's got knee pain. What we have them do is we have them lay, just kind of like we do with progressive muscle relaxation. Say, okay, lay down. We're going to teach them the relaxation breathing. And then we're going to ask them to imagine that painful knee, they're going to picture their body, and they're going to picture that knee where it hurts as glowing red, right? And then we're going to ask them to breathe in through their nose, and as they're breathing in through their nose, we're going to ask them to imagine that breath they took in through their nose goes down their body and the whole breath goes down to that knee, to that red, glowing, painful knee. And then as they breathe out, that breath comes back out. And as it comes out, it takes some of the red with it, right? And as you're breathing out some of that red. The breath coming out is actually pink, right? And then they breathe in again through their nose, and that breath is, sometimes we'll actually coach them to think, okay, you're breathing in, and as you breathe in, it becomes a silvery, glowing mist, and it goes down to that red knee, and it becomes pink. And as you blow back out of your mouth, you let out some of the pain and some of the tension, and it comes out in a pink fog as you breathe out. And every time you breathe in and it goes down and it comes down to that painful red knee, that knee is a little less red and a little less painful. Again, amazing. With practice, you can actually get a significant pain reduction. It's truly a remarkable thing to see. Works for stress, works for muscle tension, especially if you're using it in conjunction with progressive muscle relaxation. You're tensing the muscle and relaxing it. You breathe in through your nose. You imagine the breath coming to that, whatever that place in the, like say you got a tense neck and it actually hurts. That you tense up the muscles in your neck as you breathe in. You're picturing the breath coming in and taking that. Again, I often coach people that, okay, that muscle tension is red. And, as you breathe in and you breathe out, the red is slowly breathed out of your body. Again, the more you practice it, the better it works. And then there's a third version of visualization that we use, and that is with people who are practicing some complex skill. Athletics, musicians, some artists, people who in high stress jobs, special operations in the military, where we'll have them do the relaxation breathing in a quiet, peaceful place, and they're rehearsing whatever the job is. Somebody who's a baseball player and is in a hitting slump, they might do this with a sports psychologist, where they work on fixing the mechanics of their swing. And part of fixing the mechanics of their swing is actually working with a batting coach, but part of it is also visualization, picturing the perfect motion, picturing connecting every single time with the ball, and the ball hits exactly in the center of the bat, and it rockets off the bat. And you're actually coaching this visualization. You're getting them to picture a perfect process that happens every single time. And what we know is what we're doing is we're establishing neurological pathways associated with successful practice. And we're doing it in a very relaxed state. Again, it works really, really well. You see this, you can see this in professional and high-level collegiate sports where they're working with sports psychologists. The performance improvement. You want a good example of this? Look at place kickers in professional football. And you think about how difficult that job is, the stress level of that job, the distance and how narrow the goalposts are, and the remarkable rate of success. If you don't believe me that this is hard, go out sometime and try to kick a field goal from 40 yards away. Even if you're, like say you're a soccer player and you're good at kicking, and imagine being able to replicate this over and over and over and over and over again under unbelievably stressful situations where you've got 60,000 people screaming at you. And these guys can do it and make it at 40 yards 99 times out of 100. The people who are successful at this and the people who are less successful at this, the difference is often this visualization process. And then I think the last of the four, mindfulness. Mindfulness is a little bit different. Again, it often starts with relaxation breathing. But mindfulness is basically learning to regulate our attention. And essentially it is developing the capacity, and this is no small thing, developing the capacity to remain in the moment. And if you think about it, maybe you've had this experience, if not in this class, in some other class, where for whatever reason, something the teacher is talking about catches your attention, you're interested in it, and you forget to remember that you're in the class. You're so absorbed in what the teacher is talking about that you forget yourself. You're no longer sitting at a desk. You're no longer thinking like, oh God, would they just get done? It's like, go get out of here. I'm so hungry. Oh, I got to go do this later. All of that is gone, and you are just focused on what is going on right here and right now, right? And when that happens, class goes by quickly. It's a pleasant experience. You are immersed in the moment. Well, that experience is something that is subject to practice. You can become better and better and better at this. You can foster that cognitive skill to where you spend more and more time not thinking about what you're going to do, not worrying about what you got to do, not regretting something you did in the past, not thinking about how uncomfortable or unpleasant or boring this is, but simply being in the moment and experiencing it. And generally what we find in research is that this mindfulness, this being in the moment, appears to be fairly highly correlated with happiness and contentment. And it is, again, I said this a moment ago, you can get better at this. In the same way as with relaxation breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, visualization, it comes down to, are you willing to practice it? There's probably the most famous mindfulness practice is what they call the raisin meditation, and I put a link on the slide for this. But it essentially involves taking a raisin, and then they'll have you take a raisin, and the raisin is at first sitting on a desk in front of you, and they have you, they talk you through looking at the raisin and paying attention to exactly what color is it and what shape is it, and look at the wrinkles in it, and notice the shadow that it's projecting onto the desk, and where's the light coming from, and being very aware of all the physical dimensions, the visual dimensions of the raisin. And then they'll have you actually pick the raisin up and put it in your hand, and they'll have you look at the raisin and pay attention to how much does the raisin weigh, what does it feel like on the palm of your hand, right? And you turn it and look at it from all the different levels, and then have you pick it up and hold it in your fingers, and then they'll have you smell it, and they'll have it, and then talk you through all that, and they have you put it on your tongue. Not do anything with it, just put it on your tongue and close your mouth and let it sit there. What do you feel? What do you notice? Because of course, once you put it in your mouth, you can smell it. As weird as that sounds, but once you do this, you notice, yes, I can smell the raisin when it's in my mouth. In addition to beginning to taste it, and what does the texture of it feel like on your tongue, etc., etc. And they walk you through the whole process, carefully through the process of chewing it and feeling the texture of it and the taste of it, and how that changes over the course of the process of chewing it and swallowing it. And you actually, it's amazing when you really focus, you can actually notice as the raisin goes down as it's being swallowed. And it completely changes your experience of this little raisin, this little thing. But it's a good, the nice thing is you can do this with something as minimal as a raisin or any food or any moment in your life. You can practice this mindfulness, this immersion in the moment, where you're not thinking about what's coming, you're not regretting or reflecting on what has happened. You're completely immersed in just experiencing the moment. Mindfulness. Okay, so those are the 4 basic strategies that we spend a fair amount of time actually in professional practice of psychology, teaching to people to manage stress and anxiety. And they're, again, very, very effective, but largely as effective as you are willing to practice, essentially. And you can do all those 4 things on your own. Again, like I said before, there are plenty of YouTube videos that will teach you the various processes and walk you through them. There are also some practical things that you can do in your everyday life. One of the things I would tell you is identify the stress. Write it down. Document the things, even the things you can't do anything about. Get them on paper. Make a list. Now, when you make the list, go back to the list and be honest with yourself and accept responsibility for causing probably most of the things in your life that are stressful. Your choices count. And if you find yourself reacting against, kind of like, screw you, I'm not doing, the bad things in my life are not something that I chose. The odds are that they are something you chose. Now, you might have had a really good reason for choosing these things in your life. You're in college. It's stressful. It's not necessarily very much fun. But you are here because you want to be here. And if you find yourself thinking, well, no, I don't, well, then why are you here? Why have you have chosen to be here? You can walk out of the classroom. You can walk away from the college. And if you find yourself saying, oh, well, my parents would be mad, well, okay, that may very well be true. But you have chosen in that circumstance the happiness and approval of your parents over your momentary happiness. And that may very well be a very good decision. You may be choosing your future financial success or security over your current comfort. But if you look at the things in your life that are stressing you, most of them, not all, but most of them are your choice. Sometimes that's not a good choice and you need to change it. And sometimes it is a choice that you're willing to accept responsibility for. I'm sitting here on a Sunday afternoon doing what is turning into an incredibly long lecture. I apologize. There's a lot of other things I'd rather be doing on a Sunday afternoon than doing this lecture. But I've chosen it. I've chosen it for a variety of reasons. I like teaching this class, but there are other reasons that I've chosen to accept this responsibility. And when I, say if I were to write that down, my stress is I don't want to be doing this stupid lecture on a Sunday afternoon. I'd rather be fishing. I would rather be fishing. But then I stop and I think, okay, am I responsible for this circumstance? Can I walk away from this circumstance? Yes, I can. Do I want to? No, I don't. Why? Because of these reasons. And as I think about that, as I accept responsibility for that choice, the experience of stress diminishes because now I've chosen it. I'm not being subjected to it, I'm choosing it. And remember how we talked earlier, I think one of the very first slides, or one of the early slides, I was saying to you that more important than the nature of the stress itself is how we think about it, how we respond to it. If we see the stressor as something that we have chosen and we want, it instantly becomes less stressful. So that's part of the reason why I want you to write it down. The other reason is that it makes you think about, how am I responding to the stress? Am I responding in a way, am I in an approach coping response, or am I responding in some way? So in other words, am I responding in a way that's effective at doing something about it or managing the stress associated with it? Or am I responding maladaptively? Am I responding in a way that's damaging myself? Once you've written these all down, once you've documented and identified the stressors, start looking for ways that you can eliminate or at least reduce the maladaptive or unhealthy ways that you deal with stress. If your response to stress is, I need a drink, well, then guess what? You got a drinking problem. If you're every time you get stressed, you need a cigarette, or if you're smoking marijuana to help you manage the stress, well, it isn't managing the stress. It's medicating the stress away temporarily. It's doing nothing to change your circumstances. Alcohol, if you get home at the end of a busy day and I need a beer, that isn't actually addressing the stress. It's doing nothing to change the circumstances. And the same thing would apply for everything from comfort eating to avoidance by watching television, or we think of reading as a positive thing, but reading can be an escape too, right? All these different ways that are generally less effective for managing stress simply because they don't actually do anything about the stress, and they aren't doing anything to help mitigate the physiological costs of that sympathetic nervous system response. So, it's not exercise, it's not good healthy sleep, these kinds of things. And then once you find a way to reduce or eliminate these unhealthy strategies, replace them by things that actually do something about the situation. So what we're talking about is either changing the situation by avoiding it or altering the situation itself, or by changing your reaction to it. In terms of avoiding, I'm not talking about simple avoidance of all stress. That can be maladaptive. What I'm talking about is managing the stress by avoiding the avoidable. And some of the things that are actually quite productive, learning to actually say no, not being willing to assert yourself, and somebody says, can you do, being able to say no, being able to set some limits so that your day-to-day life is more tolerable. Being conscious of the people and the circumstances that make your life unpleasant. I don't know if you've ever heard this. I may have mentioned this before in class. I like the old saying that you are the 5 people with whom you spend the most time. If you want to know who you are and what's important to you, look at the people that you surround yourself with. If the people you surround yourself with are sarcastic, pessimistic, negativistic, lazy, then guess what? The odds are you are too. If, on the other hand, you want to be more positive and pleasant and gentle and kind, find people who are positive, pleasant, gentle, and kind, and spend time with them. So being very conscious of the kinds of people that you spend your time around and the situations in which you spend your time. Choose calm, pleasant situations over stressful situations whenever possible. Take control of your environment. I doubt, maybe this is the case for you guys, but one of the things, I doubt that it's as much the case for you as it is for some of the people that I talk to as patients. I can't tell you how often I've got to tell people that they need to turn off the television, that they're watching, CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, and they're watching it for 5 or 6 hours a day. And of course, what is the news? The news is one stressful thing after another. Here, this is the world ending, right? And of course, they keep you watching by making it sound as bad as they possibly can. So some of controlling your environment might be turning that off. Sometimes it's things like that actually we're enjoying. I had this happen a number of years ago. I got watching The Walking Dead. Great show. But I realized as I forget which season it was fairly far along. But I realized, I think it was like the 4th or 5th season, I realized it was so unpleasant what I was watching that I eventually got, one night I'm sitting there watching, and of course it pulls you along, right? It was a really well done television show, but I got to the point where it was just like, why am I doing this? Why am I watching this? Because I was sitting down every night watching a couple of episodes, and I got thinking, there are other things I could be doing with my time that when I got done, I wouldn't feel tired and stressed out. I would feel rejuvenated or relaxed. And it was not an easy thing, because let's face it, good show. It was not an easy thing to walk away from, but once I got away from it, I was glad I did. So taking control of your environment. And understanding the difference between should and must. The reality is, there just aren't that many things in your life that you absolutely have to do. You got to decide between what are the things I should do and what are the things I have to do. And sometimes some of the things you should do might need to be sacrificed. Not that there aren't costs to that. There can be costs to sacrificing some of those shoulds, but again, we're talking about stress level. You know, if I don't do some of these things that I think I should do, does my stress level go down or up with that? Does it go down short term or up short term? Does it go down long term or up long term? So avoid the avoidable, change the changeable. When you're in a stressful situation, take action to change the circumstances. This would include things like expressing your feelings. When somebody makes you mad, rather than just sulking or simmering, like you know, just being pissed off and angry and walking away from the situation and grumping about it and thinking about it for the rest of the day, you know, somebody makes you mad, tell them they made you mad. Say it to them. You know, somebody's being rude and hostile. Confronting them, again, appropriately is a big word, right? Like there's a lot involved in that. But you know, if you have a friend who's being rude and hostile to you, and saying to them, I know this seems very strange and awkward to say this, but saying to them, you're making me mad, or it hurts my feelings when you blah blah blah, or it upsets me when you. It upsets me isn't quite so good. The more specific you can be, the better. You know, it hurts. It hurts when you. I'm saying something to you and you walk away. It makes me feel like you don't care. I know that seems awkward to say that something like that, like to think about actually saying that something like that to one of your friends or to somebody in your family. But you would be surprised if you're doing it carefully and appropriately, and you're not trying to provoke a fight, but instead are being cautious about accepting responsibility for your own circumstances and being as gentle as you can when you talk to somebody about these things. Actually, the long-term outcome is usually positive. You know, it hurts my feelings when you ignore me. Approached gently and kindly, that gives you the opportunity to actually resolve the situation rather than just pouting about it, or rather than getting into a fight about it. Now, sometimes compromise is necessary. Sometimes compromise is necessary in terms of these interactions with people that you care about, people, your friends and your family and such. Sometimes compromise is, you know, the world can't be the way you want it to be. And that some things you can change and some things you have to accept, and paying a lot of attention to what the balance is there. Being proactive. There are strategies. For example, on the slide is ask for help if you find yourself procrastinating. There are strategies for managing procrastination, and you're going to really be confronted with this over the rest of the semester. If you're doing school from home online, it's very easy to get into a pattern where you're procrastinating. There are websites and there are YouTube videos that talk about how to manage procrastination, and most of them are fairly consistent in the content. The strategies for managing procrastination are fairly well known. So I would say go find yourself a YouTube video and look at what are the strategies for how to manage procrastination. Take responsibility for doing something about the circumstances. And the last thing I would say about in terms of changing the changeable where stress is concerned is manage your time better. And if you think you're managing your time well, take a couple of days and document carefully. On your cell phone, there are actually apps for this. Document what you're doing with literally every, say, 5 minutes of your day. You will be shocked with the amount of time that you fritter away. All of us do this. All of us. So, change the changeable, avoid the avoidable. Find some ways to adapt. Being able to take a step back and looking at the big picture, looking at what you want long term, and thinking about how to adapt your current circumstances to what you want long term can be very productive in terms of reducing stress. Sometimes we find ourselves getting tied up in, great example. Well, a great example for somebody like me anyway. Some of us find ourselves being repeatedly drawn into situations where we feel like we need to win arguments, little competitions throughout the day that feel in the moment just reflexively like I can't just let this go. I can't concede this. Learning which ones you can write off. Learning when good enough is good enough becomes a fairly significant way of avoiding stress. Do I have to win this one? Does this have to be perfect? Also, in terms of adapting, practicing the skill, because it really is a skill, of optimism. Learning to identify what is good in your circumstances. And we're going to come back to that, so I'm going to leave that as it sits, but learning to accentuate the positive things is something that can be improved with practice. And there's a reason why that's so very, very important. We're going to talk about it in a few minutes here. And then the last thing I would say about in terms of adapting is reducing or eliminating your use, especially in relationships, especially when you're dealing with people. Always, never, should, must, these kinds of things. For the classic example is, well, you always X, whatever it is. That is virtually never productive. Never. That is seldom productive in relationships, right? If you say to somebody, in some accusatory way, you always disagree with me, and they say, no, I don't. Well, guess what? They're right. They're right. Nobody always does anything. If you say always or you say never, you're wrong. Almost inevitably. Right? So, and the reality is that anytime somebody says always or never to you about something that you do or don't do, we tend to go on the defensive, and it tends to create tension and a fight and resentment. So finding a way to reduce the frequency with which we use those kinds of words tends to reduce tension in relationships. Not just in relationships, but also with ourselves. If the way you talk to yourself is using those words a lot, you're going to react to those words the same way anybody else is going to react to those words. And then, of course, we've talked about this a little bit earlier. If something isn't going to change, learning to accept it. Being conscious of the things that truly cannot be changed or fixed. There are some things in life that are just difficult. They're just rough, and there's not a damn thing you can do to get out of it. In those circumstances, be aware of this. Almost anything is better when you go through it with somebody else. Things are better. Stress and tough times are better arm in arm than they are alone. Find people that are good and kind and gentle and patient and loving, and be that way to them. Surround yourself with people who make you a better person. Lean on them. Be open and honest with them. Tell them when you're having a tough time. Listen to their advice. Doesn't mean you necessarily do it, but give them the courtesy and the respect of listening to their ideas. If you can't give them the courtesy and respect of listening to their ideas, maybe you need to pick different people. On that same note, in these relationships, learn how to let things go. Be conscious of the need to truly forgive people when they've wronged you. Somebody said, as far as I'm aware, we don't know who, said that Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I'm recommending to you that you think in terms of learning and becoming very good at forgiving people, not because I'm worried about them, but because I know that the absence of forgiveness means that you remain bitter and resentful, hurt and angry. Learning to forgive somebody isn't about necessarily letting them off the hook. It's as much as about letting yourself off the hook and reducing the tension in your own life. So learning to forgive. And then the flip side of that is learning to genuinely say you're sorry. When you screw up, when you wrong somebody, being able to give a genuine apology. And a genuine apology is not, I'm sorry, but. As soon as you say the word but, not an apology. An apology is, I'm sorry, period. Or I'm sorry, I should never have, whatever it was. I'll try never to let it happen again. I'm sorry. You don't deserve that. Generally speaking, most of us, when we make an apology, we want to clarify it. I'm sorry, and then we want to explain why we did whatever we did, which is often heard as, I'm sorry, but let me explain to you why I shouldn't actually really have to be sorry and why this is entirely okay, right? That's not actually an apology. An apology is, I'm sorry, period. That does wonderful things for relationships. And make sure that you've got good people around when you really need them. The last few things that you can do to make sure you're better coping with stress. And I've said this so many times this semester, I'll say it again today, and I'll probably say it again before the end of the semester. Health. Protect your health. You should be exercising vigorously pretty much every day of the week, at least 5 days a week. You should be exercising to the point where you're breathing hard and you're sweaty. Pretty much every day. Eat like a grown-up. Stop having the preponderance of your diet be sugar. Cut back on, I'm not saying eliminate, do not eliminate carbs, moderate carbs. Be careful that you're not getting too much caffeine. Be careful that you're, the same thing, I think I already said sugar. Sugar should be a treat, not a staple. Make sure you're getting enough, particularly D vitamin, take some fish oil, lots of fresh fruit, colorful vegetables, fish, veggie, chicken, etc. Right? This is not complicated. Everybody knows how you're supposed to be eating. The hard part is making yourself do it. I love my beer, but the reality is reduce or eliminate alcohol. You should not be smoking cigarettes at all. There's no upside to smoking cigarettes. And most drugs are problematic. I'm just telling you what the data tells us. And then, of course, you've heard me rattle on about this before. 8 hours of sleep, 7 hours minimum. If you're not sleeping well, you got to fix it. If you can't fix it on your own, go see your doctor. Get enough sleep. I think I've already probably talked to you guys about this before. But if I didn't, I want to make sure I hit it. And if I did, it can't hurt you to hear it again. If you're sleeping less than 6 hours a night, this isn't so much at your age. Your bodies can probably tolerate it, better than older people. But once you get to be in your late 30s, early 40s, if you're sleeping less than 6 hours a night, your risk of heart attack and stroke go up fourfold. You are not twice as likely, 4 times as likely to have a heart attack or a stroke. Believe it or not, if you're sleeping less than 6 hours a night, the likelihood of you being overweight increases dramatically for various physiological reasons. Memory consolidation takes place largely at night. We talked about this earlier in the semester when we talked about consciousness, levels of awareness, that kind of thing. If you are in school and you're not getting sufficient deep sleep, you might as well just be sitting there and punching yourself in the face, because you're directly countering what you need to be doing. all sorts of physiological deficits, damage takes place when you get less than 6 hours a night, even up to and including things like bone density reduction. And the real kicker is you are 4 times more likely to die, period. Period. Across the board. You are 4 times more likely to die of anything if you're getting less than 6 hours of sleep a night. So sleep, get good sleep. Again, if you can't fix it yourself, go see somebody. Some things you can try. Go online and do a web search for what we call sleep hygiene, the do's and don'ts of good sleep. Like I said before, 5 days a week at least, exercise to the point where you're breathing hard and you're sweating. Go to the grocery store, buy yourself a bottle of melatonin, take it at lights out. Nice, safe, over-the-counter sleep aid that you can't get hooked on, doesn't tend to have side effects. It's not going to sedate you. It's not a drug. Works very well. Don't use alcohol or other drugs to help you sleep. There's a variety of reasons why this is the case, not the least of which is as they're cleaned out, as your system gets them out of your bloodstream, it tends to wake you up. So you drink yourself to sleep. Even if you just have 2 or 3 drinks and you go to sleep, generally what you'll find is about 3 hours later you wake up, often to go urinate, and you have a hard time going back to sleep. And that is because of what happens to you physiologically as you metabolize the alcohol. And what you'll generally find is that you lay awake for an extended period of time. What we know is that the sleep that's associated with sedation by alcohol and drugs isn't actually normal sleep. So while you're not conscious, not fully conscious, you're not getting all the benefits from sleep if you're sedating yourself. In terms of improving sleep, be aware of your use of nicotine and caffeine in particular. Both of them are stimulants. If you're, again, not such a big deal when you're young, although for some people, even when you're young, it affects you. I would say give yourself a minimum of about a 4-hour window before you go to bed where you're not using caffeine or nicotine. And then also the last thing is just be real careful about using any sort of prescription sleep aids. Sedated sleep is not the same thing as natural sleep. You might be asleep, but you're not getting all the benefits of sleep. If you are having to sedate yourself with Ambien, say a common prescription for insomnia, if you're using Ambien to help yourself sleep, you got a problem that needs to be fixed, not drugged. So, as important as sleep and perhaps more important would be what we might call the meaning, purpose. There's a guy named Viktor Frankl who was a Jewish psychiatrist who ended up in the concentration camps in World War II. And he wrote a really famous book called Man's Search for Meaning about his experiences in the camps. And he talks in that book about the fact that they took literally everything from him, everything. All the people he knew and loved were killed. They took his medical degree, all of his clothing, all of his possessions, all of his jewelry. They burned his papers. He's a psychiatrist, has all of his professional papers. They took his practice from him. In a sense, they even took his name and tattooed a number on his arm. And somehow, in the midst of all of that, in the midst of hell that was the concentration camps, he found a way to not just to survive, but to come out of it maybe a better man than he was when he went in. And this guy said in that book, Man's Search for Meaning, he said that that a man who has sufficient why can survive any how. And what he was saying really was, if you've got a reason for getting up and going through your life every day, if you've got a good reason, if you've got something to live for, meaning and purpose, almost any obstacle can be tolerated. Right? If you've got somebody to devote yourself to, or a cause to devote yourself to, something to give you meaning and purpose, you can survive unbelievable suffering, and even, I won't say enjoy it, but feel that it's worthwhile. So finding some way to figure out what the meaning and purpose of your life is vital. This is part of what psychotherapy, certain kinds of psychotherapy do. Some people find this by journaling, writing, in support groups, by talking to people who are trying to figure out for themselves why they are. We know that talking about these things that are important to you, why you do what you do, why you suffer the stresses that you suffer, like what the purpose of it all is. Sitting down and talking to somebody honestly and openly, somebody who actually cares about you, has profound effects in terms of reducing stress, reducing the costs of stress. Having somebody actually, empathy is listening to somebody and understanding what they're dealing with to an extent that you actually feel it yourself. So somebody has their dog die, and they come and they talk to you and they say, oh, my dog died. And in telling you about how bad they're hurting, and about how much they miss their dog, and about what a sweet dog it was, and they tell you in such good detail, and they're so honest with you about it, that you actually hurt for them. Like you actually feel almost like a little bit of tear getting ready to come. You feel their sadness. You're sad too because of what they lost. That's empathy. And being able to communicate with somebody in such a way that they give you that reaction, that they feel a little bit of what you're feeling. We know it's very clear in the research that actually does reduce stress. Having somebody know what you're dealing with, having somebody know and care, actually really does make a difference. So in the course of this, talking to somebody about it is not just ranting and raving about it. It's not just sitting and cursing and cursing your fate, so to speak. You need to talk about how you feel, and the talking needs to be focused on analyzing it, I guess you could say, understanding how it's affecting you, how it feels, what it's like, the costs of it, etc. If you can find some meaning in your suffering, if you can find a reason to keep going, you can tolerate almost anything. I mean, that was Viktor Frankl's probably most valuable message related to this idea of finding meaning. We know that there's a significant correlation between regularly practicing a faith and all sorts of positive effects. Now, that's not the same thing as just saying, oh, I'm religious, or oh, I believe in God of some sort or another. What we know is that when you look at people who not only espouse a belief, but actually live in accordance with that belief. In other words, they follow the do's and don'ts of their religion. They participate in religious practices, going to church and that kind of thing. They live their belief. Positive effects across the board. Significant positive effects across the board. Just believing isn't enough. Implementation of the beliefs. So if you need a reason to go to church, like Mommy says, there's your reason. I already made mention of that. And then the other piece of it is that we know that regular religious practice tends to encourage healthy behavior. The reality is religions tend to discourage destructive behavior. You can have an argument about that. You can have an argument about there are negative consequences of particularly of very devout religious adherence. But by and large, what the religions teach you is don't abuse drugs, don't be mean to other people, don't engage in risky behavior, especially sexual behavior, that kind of thing. They encourage some rigor and caution in diet, and so on and so forth. So we know that the religious, if you're living according to religious beliefs, the odds are you're probably living a healthier lifestyle. The last thing that I'm going to mention in regard to religion is maybe the most important piece of it, and that is that most religious traditions emphasize a position of gratitude. They emphasize the idea that one should be grateful to God for one's circumstances. They tend to encourage and teach humility and gratitude. And I guess you could think about it like this. It is essentially impossible to be simultaneously grateful for your circumstances and profoundly unhappy. If you imagine feeling grateful for your life, for the people in your life, for your circumstances, it's hard to imagine also being miserable. And what we know is that they've done this study several times where they have a group of people keep journals on. They ask a group of people to write down at the end of the day 3 things that happened during the day for which they are grateful. And generally, when they set up the study, they'll have the group of people, and they'll split them in the experimental group and a control group, and the experimental group writes down at the end of the day 3 things that happened during the day that they're grateful for, and the other group just writes down 3 things that happened during the day, no mention of gratitude, right? And what they look at is over a period of time, usually it's about 6 weeks. When they look at it, what they find is the people who were writing down the 3 things for which they're grateful, 3 things from that day for which they're grateful, as opposed to just 3 things that happened during the day. The people who were writing down the 3 things for which they were grateful report significant reductions in their subjective experience of stress. They report feeling happier, physically healthier, reduced alcohol and substance use. It's like just a long list of these benefits. After anywhere from a month to 6 weeks of this practice, writing down 3 things at the end of each day, 3 things that you were grateful for. But the really cool thing about this is, so they do this study, they do it for 6 weeks, they stop it, and they come back 6 months later. They pull everybody back in, and they ask, and they look at these things again. How are they feeling? How are they doing? And the people that were doing the 3 things for which they were grateful at the end of each day, those people 6 months later, after they've stopped doing it, still report higher levels of happiness, contentment, lower levels of stress, et cetera, et cetera. So the evidence suggests that there's something almost, I would say magical, but there's something very powerful about this position of gratitude, of being grateful for your circumstances. And this is one of the things that religion promotes. Essentially all religions promote this encouragement to feel gratitude, feel blessing for the good things in your life. Some things you can do in terms of implementing this. You can do what they do in the study, where you're actually just at the end of every day, just write down 3 things. Do different things every day, 3 things that you're grateful for. These are the good things in my life. These are the ways in which I was blessed today. Consciously making a decision that I'm going to pay attention to these things. I'm going to monitor these things. I'm going to be alert to these things. Makes a difference. Be aware that the writing down 3 things at the end of the day is a good thing. Just listing them off is fine. Even better than that, though, at the end of every day, you make the list of 3 things and then meditate on them. You know, it might be, at the end of the day, it might be, I'm so very glad for your spouse or your boyfriend or your girlfriend. And rather than just checking that off the list, you might think of all the ways in which this person is wonderful. You know, it might be something like reflecting on the first time that you met this person. If it's your significant other, the first time that you kissed him or her. Some kindness that he or she did for you. Any of a myriad of, but you're not thinking about just the fact of the blessing, but the way in which you're blessed, or the way in which you're grateful, or the reasons for which, the in-depth, the reasons that you're grateful. And be aware that sometimes what they call blessings of omission can be almost as powerful. This is where you recognize that it could be worse. Like, there but for the grace of God go I. That kind of thing. Being aware that my circumstances aren't wonderful, but they could be dramatically worse than they are. These things lend themselves to a cognitive style of conscious appreciation of the good things in your life. And we know that is connected with higher levels of happiness and lower levels of stress. And I kind of jumped the gun, and I already talked to you about the idea that finding purpose and meaning in life, finding a reason that you get up every day, a reason that you suffer the things that you suffer, makes a profound difference. So we already talked about those who have a why to live can bear with any how. And I'll leave you with that. Don't forget, most dealing with stress has to do with what you do, not what is happening to you. Most of stress has to do with how you respond to it, how you think about it, rather than the actual stress itself. You have tremendous power to affect your life and the degree of stress that you are subjecting yourself to. And, well, went way over what I was expecting to. I am going to do my best next class period to reduce the length, because this was really long. Actually, the next class period is human development, so it will probably be fairly long, but remember, that is actually 2 class periods. So I will do my best to consolidate it. I can guarantee you this, it's not going to be a full 2 class periods. It's not going to be a full 5 hours. I will make every effort to keep that a little bit shorter. As of this point, I'm not planning on giving you a quiz on the stress and coping stuff. And I will update you as far as any electronic quizzes, if that ends up being a feasible thing to do remotely. Okay. All right. Well, have a good week, and I'll post another lecture, hopefully by the end of this week.